Hey everyone, welcome back to your Dawn of Autonomy podcast. I'm Dawn Zola, your host, CEO of P3 Tech Consulting and publisher at Autonomy Global. It is a month we've dedicated to AI and data, which are two buzzwords that mean everything in the autonomy world. And this month has been sponsored by Victus Technologies. If you haven't seen the show from last week with Jesse Hamill, you absolutely have to check that out. He was also on our full crew yesterday with some other incredible experts talking about this very topic of AI as well. And we have a very dear friend to the show on today, James Grimsley from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. We love you, James. Thank you so much for returning to the show in this month to talk about everything that's been going on with the Choctaw Nation, emerging technologies, and how you guys are leveraging AI and data in all the things you're doing. So, welcome back.
You bet, and always enjoy talking to you, Don. You're one of my favorite people to chat and converse and pontificate with in the industry. So very happy to be.
You know what? It is the first time I met James, everybody. And by the way, we are live. Just a reminder. So jump in the chat, say hi, ask your questions. Very first time I met James was at Commercial UAV. It was like my very first commercial UAV before I even started my company. And I remember going to a party and sitting there and talking about the Fourth Amendment for like an hour at a table with James. And I thought he was an attorney because he's just so knowledgeable. But James, you're not an attorney. You're just incredibly knowledgeable about everything from engineering to the law in this space. But for those that don't know you, can you tell them a little bit about that background that informs this
Sure.
base of knowledge that you bring to the table?
Sure. So believe it or not, I started college as a music major. So toward the end of high school, I always loved science and math. You know, I grew up watching Apollo missions, but I loved art. I loved music, and I was always conflicted what I was going to do. And so went to school initially on a music scholarship, was living the life. It was just a cool time, doing music all the time. And then I started to realize that it was going to be difficult to survive as a musician and even afford to buy gear. And that engineering sounded really good. So I did something crazy. I walked across campus and told College of Engineering I wanted to declare aerospace engineering as my major. The first response was, "Are you crazy? Because you don't even have math or calculus or anything like that." But I thoroughly enjoyed it. And good thing is I'm still a musician. Now I can afford to be a musician because engineering, make it great salaries. But yeah, I was always the kid in class that didn't like to stay on topic because it would always thread. There was other things I wanted to learn too. It's like there was always a bigger picture. And so had several opportunities in my career where I've kind of had those, as you know, in the military, it's called the career broadening experiences. I had several of those. And one was actually getting real heavily into the policy and law. And I was pulled under sort of the wing of some good friends who were law faculty when I was at the University of Oklahoma. And they said, we need to do a paper together. And so we spent a year really doing a thorough deep dive of that really weird interaction between First and Fourth Amendment, and what that means for drones in the future. There's all kinds of profound questions legally that start to pop up when we look at how drones operate, where they operate, things like that. And it
Well,
was a
and
good,
that's, James, those questions they still come up.
yes,
I
they do.
mean, just this FAA NOTAM that they just pushed out in
Yes.
the last couple of weeks, with these roving kind of, protective bubbles over some federal, moving vehicles and escorts and again, unclear somewhat in the language used, but also personnel. That does raise First Amendment issues potentially if there's a media group that wants to use a drone to cover something like an ICE raid. I mean, people are covering these with their cell phones, and to have something like, oh, can't have, coverage from the sky, it just creates all kinds of issues. By the way, we've got Ben with Vets to Drones out there, James, and he
Great.
said he's very interested in hearing about what you guys are doing with BVLOS, how you're conducting it. So Ben, hang on. We are going to get there. But the point is, James has this incredible background. He's been on the show several times, written multiple articles with and, about James and the Choctaw Nation. You can find them on Autonomy Global. Actually, I wrote one article for Forbes.com back in the day. So check it out. But, basically, musician turned engineer, dabbled in the law and policy stuff, faculty at the University of Oklahoma, worked for the Department of Transportation out there in Oklahoma. And then at some point, the Choctaw Nation, which, by the way, James grew up right there, very immersed in that community, recognized his talent, pulled him in early on and said, hey, we're looking to do something interesting with our land for emerging technologies. What are your thoughts? And I know that was like the origin story for how you guys became an original test site, and also became part of the EIPP, or the Integration Pilot Program, the IPP, that became Beyond, and all the things you're doing out there. So just amazing. And like, I've been watching. And by the way, everybody, if you don't know about Daisy Ranch, that's what this land is called, where the Choctaw Nation and James are out there doing a lot of this testing. It's beautiful. It's huge. You've been working out there for years, but something really relatively new is this advanced technology center. You guys had a ribbon cutting. Was it last year?
Back in June of 2025.
Okay, tell us about that.
So it's what we're calling the phase one of our plans. When I first started interacting with Choctaw several years ago, we pulled in industry experts and we asked them a question: what would a test environment look like 30 years from now? We're not concerned 5 years from now. What will it look like 30 years from now? And we always hear the word future-proof, which is very difficult to do. But what's our best effort right now to try to future-proof and design something that's relevant for decades? So we had some experts from NASA, companies like Bell Flight. We brought in those leading thinkers at the time. And it was interesting. The unique thing about the Choctaw Nation is the Choctaws have a true physical test range. It's not an administrative construct. The Choctaws own the property. The Choctaws control it. We have sovereign jurisdiction over the surface. We can pass laws. We can do what we need to do. We're exempt from some federal regulations because of our sovereignty and the status of the treaty with the U.S. government. But we have something that's very unique with terrain diversity. There are all sorts of terrain. It goes from flat areas to rising hills to all sorts of valleys. And it's the closest thing to some of the military test ranges that's out there, in my opinion, because our sovereignty over the surface allows us to control the ground risk. We manage and mitigate air risk by a layered approach. We've invested in our own radar networks, we have our own closed ADS-B receiver network. We have our own basically C2 network, multiple bands. We had some kind of first of type things happen, with the spectrum there. So we went into this looking at it as a marathon. When I spoke with the leadership, we were not trying to do a sprint where we just in 6 months, this is, it's going to be this resounding success. A difference with tribal governments, tribal cultures versus other types of governments is that tribal governments are very generational. They think in terms of impact of generations. And that you get into kind of whole notion of a 7-generation model, what effects propagate down. And when I interact with our leadership, a lot of these are elders within the Choctaw Nation. When I interact with them, when we talk about the future, their questions involve, what will this do for our grandchildren? What will this do for our great-grandchildren? What will this do 20 years from now or 30 years from now? And so it's very interesting environment, because that long-term vision and almost the marathon approach versus the sprint, it almost insulates us from hype. We ignore the noise day to day because we have our vision out years from now. We know what we want to see. We know what the fundamental issues we're trying to solve in the Choctaw Nation for the Choctaw people are, and we're able to look out on that horizon and stay focused on that. So it's a much different environment than I've ever been involved in terms of innovation, technology adoption, technology innovation. But growing up there, my roots are deep within the Choctaw Nation. Both sides of my family go back multiple generations. The interesting thing about Daisy Ranch is that my great grandmother was born on that property. So I have one side of my family literally from where the Daisy Ranch is located. So I know the area well. I have so many cousins and distant cousins and everything else that's hard to keep track of, in that area.
That is so cool. By the way, just a couple of fun facts, everybody. Number one, I was out there, did a PBS special for the Wings Over the Rockies Museum. By the way, Emmy nominated series, part of an Emmy nominated series. We didn't win, but we were nominated, which was cool. And, so James was in that. You can find that on YouTube under the Wings of the Rockies YouTube page. What a great experience that was working with you on that, James. And got the honor and opportunity to see the amazing museum you guys have there in Durant, Oklahoma. Got to talk about a lot of things. Other fun fact, Reba McEntire's from that area. She has an amazing restaurant there too. And the casino, I've been to a lot of casinos, James. Go to Vegas frequently, and not just for commercial UAV, but so many other conferences. And, I've got some family out there. So the casino you guys put up is just really unparalleled. And I remember driving out of there to go back to the airport, and on the sign was like Journey, it was like playing. I'm like, why am I leaving right now? But let's talk about like the gap, you guys. You talk about this kind of 7-generation outlook, and kind of what's this going to be in 30 years? And when the Choctaws brought you in to do basically an analysis of the property, what it could be used for back in the day, and this is really, really early on. At some point, you guys landed on emerging aviation technologies, drones in particular, but also that 30-year outlook. Air taxis will be next. AI is going to be a thing. It's all about the data. You guys had all of this in mind as you guys broke ground out there at Daisy Ranch. And again, obviously the buildings and everything have changed over time. But the big gap you guys were trying to fill really was all about the nation, not only jobs, right, and education for the people, but also this healthcare gap. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. You mentioned Reba McEntire. Reba father actually owned some of that property years ago and sold it off. And so some of her roots are actually on Daisy Ranch. She
That's so
came
cool.
out, spent a day with us with Rex Lynn. And so she and Rex Lynn came out, spent a day, loved it. She thought it was pretty cool. So yeah, kind of back to the roots. So if you look at what's going on, when I grew up in the Choctaw Reservation, it was one of the most impoverished areas in the United States, in southeastern Oklahoma. If you had any chance of leaving, you left. And if you had any potential to go to college, I'm a first generation university graduate. That was just things that weren't encouraged. What happens a lot of times when you have communities that have generational poverty is learned helplessness. You look around, you say, I shouldn't set expectations because I don't want to fail and be disappointed, because
Right.
that's the one thing you don't want to be, is disappointed. And fortunately, when I grew up, I had enthusiasm about music. I had enthusiasm about science and technology and engineering and aerospace. Had all of these things that I was just excited about and dreaming as a young kid. But I also graduated at a time when you could go to college at a state school and work a minimum wage job delivering pizza or cooking hamburgers. You could pay your way through. So I was able to pay my way through school I didn't start with a trust fund, and had to pay my way through school. And I never thought I would go back. Had a great career. I started working with cruise missiles. I started with the Air Force as an electronics engineer with the Air Force, working on a lot of the Reagan era systems. And cruise missiles are, in a sense, unmanned aircraft. They just don't return home, or we don't want them to return home.
Right.
I've done some UAS in college as an engineering student. We had some research projects. We didn't call them UAS. They were just remotely piloted aircraft. Everyone considered it toy aircraft. If we'd called the tower at the FAA and said we're going to do this operation, they would have said, "Go play with your toys and leave us alone, kids." That type of thing.
Right.
It was kind of a really weird Wild West time, but always kept falling back to kind of emerging aviation, novel technologies throughout my career. And it was around 2006 when I was looking at what the Air Force Research Laboratory was done. Actually, had a couple of successful SBIR proposals that I've worked on with early micro air vehicles, is what they were calling MAVs at the time. I decided that was my passion. I was so excited about the potential. And so around 2006 is when I started looking at it. And then by 2007, I was pretty heavily involved in it. Of course, I had to explain to my friends why I was working with toy airplanes and how are you going to make a living doing that, But we saw this unlimited potential. But to answer your question, early on, one of the things, having lived in a rural area, kind of the backstory, when I grew up, my dad worked for the phone company. It was actually a fairly affluent job. It was a blue collar job, but a fluent job in a really poor area. But my connection to the outside world, growing up in Atoka County and in the Choctaw Reservation back in the 60s and 70s, was that I got information on just a limited number of ways. There were a couple of television stations that mostly came through if the weather was good. The telephone, the copper telephone lines, and then a very limited library in the town at the school. I mean, it didn't take long. You read all the books. And so interesting that in my lifetime, I started out where I lived in a very rich country, but we didn't have access to a whole lot of information or knowledge really. And one of the things that happened in my lifetime was we went from having, the mark of the first world nation was these countries that had all this copper in the ground and copper telephone network, stuff like that, to now anywhere there's a cell network in the world and someone has a smartphone, they have access to the history of the knowledge of mankind, which is amazing. Not even the richest, most powerful person in the 1970s had that. And what we've done is we've seen how technology equalizes what it means to live in a remote area versus an urban, metropolitan place. We've equalized access to knowledge and information. What we have not equalized are the other things, and it involves access problems. It's access to immediate health care, access to quality this, quality that. It's an access to X problem. And these ultimately really start to boil down to transportation problems. If you look at a place like Choctaw Nation, it's a rural area. Our rural highways in the United States are not great. They're not safe. They're not up to the levels that we want them to be in the modern world. And we will probably never have them up to that because we don't have enough money on the horizon for that type of infrastructure. So we have to figure out how we leapfrog. And technology is a great tool to leapfrog. And if you think about all of the countries around the world who were third world nations who had no copper virtually in the ground, no networks like that, they leapfrogged and had parity and equality with the rest of the world that had invested a century or century and a half in copper. But it's a great equalizer. And so if you think about the things in the Choctaw Nation, there are places in the Choctaw Nation where an ambulance can take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour and a half to get to you. You call serious condition, that means a lot of conditions you're going to die. Your zip code becomes this really interesting predictor of health outcomes, predictor of what's going to happen to you. If you're in Los Angeles or Dallas or Tulsa or a place like that, an ambulance is at your house in 4 to 7 minutes. And if you think about it, all these access problems directly impact health. Your zip code does determine the quality of life a lot of times in the United States, what you have access to. So early on, I recognized that things like drone delivery and things in rural areas was totally different than what we're going to see in urban areas. A lot of times application in urban areas are more convenience or novelty, but these are life-changing things in rural areas that actually dramatically impact health. And that's why we're not really focused on convenience items or retail type things right now. We're focused on the things that directly will impact health. We're looking clinic to clinic operations, which I'll talk about a little bit. We're looking at those types of things. Those things justify the investment of infrastructure because we can invest far less in that infrastructure to achieve outcomes rather than investing in roads, trying to get the equivalent levels of safety.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great bridge to beyond visual line of sight, right? Because it kind of defeats the purpose if you have to be chasing a drone and having it in your sight within, whatever mile, whatever. So this upcoming rule is super critical, I think, not just for anyone looking to do advanced operations repeatably in a scalable manner that's economically feasible, but when you frame it like that, James, in terms of rural communities and tribal nations like the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, truly a life and death rule that will allow these critical missions to occur finally in a routine way. We just saw, I think that the rule with Part 108, 149 was just kind of reopened briefly to look at two major things: electronic conspicuity and right-of-way rules. Those were two, I think, of the most controversial things, even out of the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee, of the ARC report that was back in 2021. I mean, it's 5 years now. Rule kind of closed down October 6th, I think. Everybody, government shut down for a period of time. Everybody's like, what's happening? And then out of nowhere, it's like, oh, hey guys, we'd like more comments on this. And James, you and I were talking before the show about what roughly little less 500 or roughly comments came in on these things. Super important. I know you've been working on them, but when it, to Ben's point out there, vets to drones, as you guys have been doing some advanced operations with a lot of different stakeholders on your property, how have you been handling beyond visual line of sight, and kind of what do you foresee in the future with if this rule really opens up the skies in a better way?
Sure. So when we started, there are a lot of challenges to BVLOS. I did serve on the ARC, had one of the sub-working group leadership roles in the first phase, and then functioned in one of the committees in the second part. And I defend the ARC. I know there, whenever you have something this complex, it's difficult because we have to reach consensus and we have to balance so many different things. And since the ARC ended 4 years ago, a lot of people come and say, well, why didn't you think about this? Why didn't you do that? Well, we were balancing technology, policy, safety, public interest. There's so many things that you balance. And it's very educational to be part of an ARC because you see the sausage making, how the rules are made. And it's
Right.
difficult. The reality is it's an overworn statement, but it's very true. And that is that technology continues to outpace where we are on the regulatory front. And we've always, if you look at the public's expectation of our aviation system, we have very high expectations for safety. We don't tolerate accidents. We're more tolerant of things happening on the ground. We have 45,000 fatalities on our highways every year, and we don't make a lot of noise about that, but we don't tolerate things in the air, and we shouldn't. I 100%, we as a society have done good. We've set a high expectation, and we've worked toward meeting that expectation. That poses challenges moving in the future, because if you think about it, I love the way that Michael Kratsios, the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, I liked what he said. He said, we're in an environment now where technologies are no longer born in the wild, they're born in captivity. So they're born in sort of a regulated environment. The Wright brothers did not have to self-certify. They did not have to work on their manufacturing process. They did not have to set operating requirements, right? If you think about where things start versus where they go.
Right.
So we can't have the Wild West. No one would tolerate that. But how do we create the flexibility to innovate, to move forward, and adapt to the future within a strict regulatory environment? Very difficult. So the big thing that we have right now, if you look at, I'll just take electronic conspicuity. This is, the recent reopening of the rule dealt with the electronic conspicuity that impacts on the lower altitude right away. Right?
And if possible, James, let's tie your comments, if possible, to this idea of AI and data, right? The theme of the month, because when you think about electronic conspicuity, those two things kind of jump out at me as being highly relevant to how you achieve that.
So if you look at electronic conspicuity, it boils down to the ability to see and be seen in the airspace. As you probably recall with 9/11, there are aircraft we didn't know who they were. We, basically we could paint some of them with radar and know that something's there, but we didn't know who they were. And it was a big problem. We had to shut the airspace down, and you didn't know friend for foe. It was a really stressful day for a lot of people in aviation. And so there's been a security focus as well as a safety focus on how do we identify who's in the air and track. It's very complicated. There's even constitutional boundaries and issues that pop up with that, first and foremost, things that pop up with those things. But if you look at the tools that we've traditionally relied on, stuff like ADS-B, part of Next Gen back in the 90s. In the 90s, we had at most maybe 5,000 aircraft in the air at one time. None of these systems were envisioned where we have maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of it wasn't. And ADS-B, the best description I've heard of this is that ADS-B is basically everyone shouting at each other. It's here's my tail, or here's where I am, this is my altitude, shouting at each other, right?
I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the arguments I've always pushed back on is I've heard people say, we're at capacity with our national airspace system. We are nowhere near capacity with our national airspace system. We may be at capacity in certain locations with how we manage our national airspace system, but we're not at physical capacity. In order to manage it more effectively, there's all kinds of complicated things that we're going to have to address. And so this is where I see AI coming in. We're seeing all of the things happening with large language models. That's a little different than other forms of AI that we've done in the past. There's different types that have different applications, different limitations. Some are going to be dead ends, some are going to possibly continue to expand. But a lot of safety issues are the human. I can only look in front of me. I can't look behind me at the same time. There's all kinds of limitations. It takes me several milliseconds to respond to something, not to mention come up with here's an alternate way to deal with the situation. So we're running into situations where the humans are becoming the limited factor. And you think about how we manage our airspace. We have to look at the cognitive load of people, pilots and air traffic controllers. That becomes a limiting factor. So as we see things like AI and automation, the reality is we're seeing systems start to outperform humans. The reality is that a driverless automobile in the future, when we get them trained properly and things like that, it will outperform a human in terms of safety by just enormous orders of magnitude. That driverless vehicle can see in 6 directions at once, up, down, behind, side, everything. It can evaluate 100,000 scenarios as alternate responses, whereas a human might be able to do one in a few milliseconds, right? So there's all these things in the future. But the interesting thing is, how are we going to trust it? I was part of a task force with a task group with AIAA a few years ago that spawned out of some comments. Actually spoke at a White House event back in 2022 where we were pontificating, impact of AI and things. And so we started looking at the impact of things like AI on like certification. And our certification processes are not even set up for things like AI because our certification process is based on deterministic systems. That system is repeatable, predictable. If I put an input in it, I get a definite output, and that's not going to change a week from now or a year from now. It's always going to be the same. But what if the system is able to learn from its environment and get better? So if I put an input in today and I get an output, I may have a different output a month from now, but there's a high likelihood that that output is better. But how do we define trust? How do we say this meets some certification? We're not there yet. And it's almost coming back to, why do we trust a 16-year-old to drive a car? Or why do we trust a 16-year-old to pilot an aircraft, right? If they're taking a pilot's license. How do we define that? We're not good yet at defining trust and technology. We trust each other sometimes. Humans shouldn't always do that, but we sometimes trust each other to be safe. But we don't trust these machines. And the reality is machines may be better. So.
Well, it's so funny. I literally just wrote the article. It's going to be published on Monday based on the full crew yesterday. And that was a big segment of the show, was this idea of, how do you trust, how do you actually evaluate the AI itself? Or is it just going to be, are there going to just be black boxes? You have to basically trust the source. In other words, the company that's putting it out, because they're not going to show you essentially behind the curtain and all of these things. But to your point, I think Jesse was the one that was talking about how AI in many cases has already moved beyond human capability. I mean, you look at, if you recall, James, the last couple of years, there was a lot of kerfuffle over an AI that beat a real fighter pilot in a simulated dogfight. And so when you think about electronic conspicuity, you're kind of bringing back to this and beyond visual line of sight, those maneuvers in the sky, those are the kind of maneuvers you're going to need to avoid, right? Crashing with another vehicle out there. And if AI can help with that, that's really cool. But again, how was that trained? I remember Missy Cummings. I don't know if you've heard of Missy. Okay, yeah. So very, very well-known engineer, former Navy pilot. I interviewed her a while ago at Duke Law, and we were talking about AI. This was like maybe 4 years ago. And, she was just saying, AI is just not there in terms of dynamic environments. So in the military context, targeting, right? You can't really offload this idea of go, no-go decisions on targeting to AI, because if a little kid runs into that scene, if you will, and into that area that could potentially be impacted, the AI won't be able to react fast enough. I feel like we've actually, in the 4 years, we've kind of maybe almost gotten there. I mean, I was at CES last month, James. You would have loved it, by the way. You need to come next year. AI, I think over 3,000 AI vendors, but physical AI.
Right.
Everybody's, from agentic AI to now physical AI, where the AI is controlling physical motion and movements of robots, and tons of robots there, of course, too. So really, really, really cool stuff happening. And so how, like, in terms of, whether it's electronic conspicuity, whether it's ADS-B, or this whole entire system you've created out there with the Choctaw Nation for Beyond Visual Line of Sight, how are you guys leveraging AI and data in your daily operations?
Sure. Actually, very timely. The background, I'm actually sitting at the Transportation Safety Institute today at the Mike Monroney Aeronautical Center in Oklahoma City. I'm actually teaching aircraft accident investigation courses for the FAA FISDOs, the people involved in, the public officials involved in aircraft accident investigations. I'm teaching courses about what future accidents are going to look like. And one of the things we're talking about is if AI creeps into stuff, by intention or not, what will it look like in the future when you're reconstructing things? Here's an interesting thing about AI. The way we're using AI right now is just like everyone else. It speeds up your productivity. As an engineer, I can take ChatGPT. It can spit out routine code. If I'm writing some embedded software or something, it can spit it out much faster than I can start from scratch and build a library or something. So
it's almost like that Uber calculator, right?
Yeah,
like many people forgot how to do math because it's
sure.
like, why would I need to?
It's like a really big Encyclopedia Britannica is what you could think of that. The thing about LLM, and this is where it's going to start to differ, because we have different types of AI systems. Large language models are just that. They're trained on written stuff. It's stuff that's been written by humans, observations, theories, and things. And so there's a finite number of things that humans have written. I heard someone say recently that if you read everything that humans have written and just started reading nonstop, it would take you 700,000 years to read through everything. But in reality, pretty quickly, we're going to run out of the original content that humans have written. We're not always that original. And so as we run out of it, we may see a dead end with LLMs in terms of what appears to be growth and capability. We may see a limit on that. We may see it start to become more like it's starting to train on stuff that ChatGPT wrote, and then you start to look at how meaningful that becomes, right? The future, and this is where we're going to get into weather. Like, we're trying to figure out how we improve weather prediction so that we can basically start to predict more precisely, like gustiness or winds aloft or even severe outbreaks. I was involved in some of this when I was at the University of Oklahoma. We were looking at how do we tighten up our weather models and stuff. And if you look at that, a lot of these things become world models. There's not like a bunch of written text that we can just analyze and look at the probability of this word follows this word and come up with an LLM for it. It has to do with we're somehow observing the environment around us, and we're able to deduce data from that. The potential there is as we start to develop these world models, if you think about it, we have all kinds of sensors that operate out of the range that humans can. They can see things we can't see, hear things we can't hear, sense things. And so if you think about what happens if we have the ability where we start to range these sensors and we have systems that can somehow learn, observe, and establish relationships, we may see things start to happen as we develop world models where stuff starts to become realized that humans could never realize it. We don't have the sensory capability to do it. And so it's going to be an interesting future when these systems identify things or identify artifacts or they identify trends that humans have never been able to see. How that applies to aircraft is like today, when I was talking about how do we go into an accident and then open the AI box and look at cause and effect? Is there anything even meaningful to a human when we look at all this stuff in the machine itself? And so it's interesting. But here's just what we have to balance. This is the hard part. As an engineer, I'm very fascinated with a system that can make itself better, something that can learn. I'm fascinated by that.
That's cool.
Like if I were a pilot and I'm flying and I hit turbulence or something, and I learned some new technique, I'm going to pull back on this. I learned some maneuver. I don't have the ability to go home that night and call every single pilot in the world and say, guess what I just learned? If you do this little trick, if you hit, I don't have the ability to do that. When we see systems that start to incorporate that type of reinforcement learning, like Tesla vehicles and things like that, those vehicles have the ability to all kind of connect at night when they're recharging, share data. And so what you potentially have in the future is that instead of taking 40 years, like it's taken me 40 years to be as poor of a driver, automobile driver as I am, right?
Yeah.
What if a vehicle itself can learn from the experiences of thousands of lifetimes every day, and every day it gets better? The
Man, we are
potential.
so outnumbered, dude. Like
I
now
know.
you got me paranoid about my Tesla sitting in my garage just talking to other people. I swear to God, one day, and this was about a year or maybe longer ago, James, my Tesla literally kind of a pop-up came up like for me to connect my health information to the car.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh hell no. You
Exactly.
know, I was like, what is happening right now?
Exactly.
So like when you think about, you know, you can't think about AI without thinking about data
Right.
because data, right, informs that AI. And when you think about the emerging aviation operations you guys are doing on a daily basis, you're facilitating, you know, all of these things converge there at the Daisy Ranch. So I want to get granular with people because we've got folks like Ben out there, you know, that's the drones. He wants to know, you know, how people can plug into your efforts, you know,
Sure.
because it's not always obvious. You know, you hear about these test sites, you hear about ranges, you know, everybody has, you know, whatever they're calling themselves. I mean, you guys have the official moniker for real, but how how can people plug into your efforts? Like
Sure.
how, as a practical matter, do they do that?
Sure. And kind of to set the stage, we are an official FAA-UAS test site. And so,
Yep.
we do have the authorities that come, or the benefits that flow out of the 44803 stuff at the test sites. We're also beyond phase 2 site. We're the only one right now that has what's called the Section 920B3 waiver, which is a very unique waiver. It mirrors the old Charlie waivers, but a little bit different in some unique ways. So how people engage with us is we just have them reach out to us. We gauge what they need. A lot of times we have organizations that come in very mature and they just need to come out and fly in our environment. We have all the safety mitigations. They need to do some operations and fly under our different waivers and approvals that we have. A lot of times people are earlier stage and then they need to figure out, is something even viable? So we engage people different ways. We're not always equipped to help at any particular stage, but we just tell people always start, just bring us a proposition. We're not good at providing that initial proposition. People bring a proposition, let's talk about it and figure it out. We are able to sustain and safely do lots of concurrent operations at our range. And so we may have multiple customers flying. We have the ability that if somebody wants the entire range, they can exclusively come out and just have exclusive control. It costs more to do that, but we do offer that possibility. But what we do offer is all sorts of things. We offer not only those regulatory tools that we have in our toolbox now. We have multiple layers of radar. We have 2 different types of radar that we use at our range itself. We have our own ADS-B closed receiver network, ground network. We have our own multi-band C2 network, and all sorts. So all of those things fall within that traditional safety approach. In a lot of ways, we overdo it right now because the things we're doing, I don't think are going to be scalable. That's why I'm really motivated to see universal electronic security. It may eliminate those mitigations we have to build out. It may solve some of the problems that we're having to solve by peppering the landscape with radar right now. But we look at engaging. We work with agencies. We work with private individuals. We work with a lot of academic institutions. I always have to warn people at heart, I'm kind of like an academic researcher. I love novel things, and that tends to appeal to me, and I always gravitate to those things. But we just tell people to reach out. It's UAS at ChoctawNation.com, just UAS at ChoctawNation.com. And we try to get back to people quickly and set up a call on what they're doing and see if there's potential. We're open to propositions if people will tell us what they want to do.
And James, this includes not just, you know, drone flights, you know, beyond visual line of sight, all of these things, but also counter UAS, right? Like, but the agency itself has to kind of bring those authorities with them, just because the way it's structured right now with Congress and everything. But I guess here's my question to you, James, going off script. I know this official designation is more relatively recent, if I
Yeah.
recall
Late
correctly.
December.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Are you guys looking? So you have this amazing facility out there in Oklahoma, and clearly you want people to come on down. Some of these other test sites that have been around a little bit longer, they're kind of exporting their authorities, if you will. You know, like taking them on the road and working with other states.
Sure.
Is that something you foresee that you would be able to do, is take that expertise that you have curated over the last couple of years now with this new mantle and go out and help others if they don't come to Oklahoma?
Sure. Yeah. So there's actually probably two different answers. One's like a legal answer, versus one's kind of like the business, long-term
Yeah.
So the test sites can operate outside of the jurisdiction. So we are one of the 9 FAA UAS test sites, so they can operate outside the jurisdiction. However, our jurisdiction is our reservation. It's 11,000 square miles, and so there's benefits with our sovereignty within that reservation itself. The way we see the things that we're learning, we represent a whole lot of the United States, because a lot of the United States is remote, sparsely populated.
Yes.
Land doesn't vote, except you could argue that it votes in the Senate because there's like equal representation for land and Senate, but land doesn't really vote. And we see ourselves as kind of pioneering what it looks like for communities that are emerging, where they're looking at the future, where they try to equalize. And so other tribal nations, there are something like 500 and I think 30 plus federally recognized tribes, but there's also rural communities that are very similar to ours. And so we're looking at that. The problems that we are solving will hopefully be a roadmap for those communities.
Yeah.
We're trying to find that balance of what's that infrastructure we need to build out to meet the safety requirements without overbuilding, because that'll impact ROI or ability to build out, the scale out, things like that. So we're trying to solve a lot of those problems that will create a blueprint for other companies. We do work with other tribes. We host a lot. There's a lot of diversity in the tribes in terms of size. We're the third largest, 230,000 plus enrolled tribal members. Some may be less than 1,000, some may be 5,000. So there's a big range of sizes, which means that those tribes have different resources available to them. I mean, we're a very large, sophisticated government with a lot of resources available to us. Some tribes don't necessarily have that. And so, but we're blazing a trail that ultimately will help those that don't necessarily have the resources to blaze a trail. They can take advantage of what we're learning. I think the biggest things that we're going to be able to contribute, though, if you look at outside of our boundary, that lessons learned about how we scale the safety infrastructure, those are going to be some of the most important lessons that we'll see, hopefully, that we can share and then see put in place elsewhere outside of our boundaries. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. But.
No, absolutely. No, good stuff. And Ben's out there saying he's got your link. So sounds like you're going to hear from Ben soon there, James. Great. No, hopefully others as well. You all have been doing so many amazing things. And thanks for taking time out. I know you're in the middle of some NTSB training for accident investigations, and you're hopping next to an e-conspicuity working group. I mean, this man is so busy. But this update on what you're doing out there at the Choctaw Nation is amazing. We've got 2 minutes left, James, and
okay.
I would love, if possible, number one, like reinforce where people can find you again. But I would love maybe to end on this note of kind of what's out there in the future, because you've got this amazing building now. You said it's phase 1, if you will. We're hearing things about corridors, like maybe for air taxis between Durant, maybe Dallas, I don't know, maybe Tulsa, just throwing it out there. Can you give us real quick, we got 1 minute left now because I talked too long, real quick, like shotgun, what can we expect to see over the next year, 5 years, maybe 30?
I'm predicting over the next 5 years is where we'll see dramatic impacts and effects. And that is because we have generational shifts going on in terms of the generations who are making decisions and things like that. My target for the past many years has been 2030. I think by 2030, we're going to be in a much different place for a variety of reasons. And I think we're going to see more wide-scale adoption. 108, we, fingers crossed, will be out a final rule this year. It's not super easy, simple rule. It's going to be a little bit complicated. There's going to be safety reasons, a lot of things we have to do. But I believe that is starting to send a signal to UTM companies. It's starting to send the signals of surety to people. So I believe by 2030, we will start to see, what you'll see is the business cases are different in rural areas versus urban areas. And we have reasons to invest in infrastructure beyond like convenience or novelty. And so I think you'll probably be surprised at what you see in rural areas over the next 5 years versus urban. And it may look like the rural areas are speeding up because we have real needs that we're willing to address, invest in, and solve. And so I think that'll happen. It's going to be interesting. The hardest thing for me is when somebody comes to me right now and says, what should I think of as a job. I'm graduating from high school. I want to know what's the best career. I have a hard time answering that. Things are
That
changing
is a
so
tough one,
quickly.
man.
It
But
is.
more directly for the Choctaw Nation, what
Yeah.
does phase two look
Oh,
like?
we are
30
working.
seconds, go.
Sure, we're working heavily with North Texas because that's our neighbor, and we benefit greatly from the North Texas economy. Lots of things are happening. We are looking at corridors, obviously linking DFW Airport, Alliance Airport with all of our resources. So a lot is on the horizon in the next 5 years in the Choctaw Nation.
All right. Well, we can't wait, and we're going to be watching closely. And everyone, by the way, James will be a part of Law Tech Connect this year at Exponential, talking about advanced air mobility. So maybe we'll hear even more about that air taxi side of business on what is happening out there at Choctaw and what we might expect to see. There are applications for the eVTOL IPP pending. I think exciting times on the horizon, James. Thank you again so much for taking this time. Thank you, everybody out there, for watching today. It is Data and AI Month, all thanks to Victus Technologies. Thank you, James, again for joining us. And that's all she wrote. We are out here.